It can get quite overwhelming when we write scientific reports because there's just so much information to take in and understand, and we often feel like I have to include this, I have to include this, and we end up including nothing, and our paper looks very bleak. And even if we do, our paper is very, not satisfactory. And so today I'm going to synthesize all the information that's out there. And so we're going to look at a few key points that should run throughout your paper, and we're going to ensure this through examples and everything. So without further ado, let's just get straight into the video. Okay, so now let's look at some key tips when it comes to scientific writing. Alright, so when you write a scientific paper, your goal is not just to present results. You need to tell a story. When you present results, when the main focus is delivering results, the entire paper outlines everything you did and then says something reasonable about it. So that's quite normal. However, when you're just saying that, look, as X increases, Y increases, and you have a graph, that's raw data, that's just providing raw data, and that is of limited value. And it's usually only can usually only be interpreted by experts in that field. So real value is attributed to the insights and understanding of the data. And so that's when you have to present a story. If you look at this flowchart over here, you have the data and that's the results. That's just you presenting the results. You want to extract the information. This is only something that experts can do. Then you want to show, but then here's where you start presenting the story. The last 2 points, your knowledge and your understanding. Here's where you show them that you know. In the knowledge, you want to show them that, look, this is the insights, and understanding is what we can learn from these insights. So that's what that means. Okay, so now there's 3 key other things to keep in mind: brevity, logic and clarity, and clean typing. So brevity. It is essential to maintain brevity. Choose words selectively. Don't just use words to sound smart. It's not going to make you sound smart. In fact, teachers or professors can easily recognize that this person is trying to sound smart. This person is desperate. And that kind of makes you sound even dumber. So don't use too many words, because that's going to make you sound dumb to experts. It's going to waste the reader's time, and they're probably just going to leave your paper. Okay, logic and clarity. Your arguments, so your points, should be arranged step by step so that the reader can easily follow and understand what you are trying to say. And this comes from planning. You want to plan it so that everything is in proper order. The reader should feel as if they're absorbing ideas, not reading. When you read a good book and you get so absorbed into it that you're just reading, just flipping pages. You're not even paying attention that, oh, well, I had a target of reading 5 pages. No, you're just reading. And that's exactly what you want to do here. You want to make it flow very nicely. And this is something that we're going to look at over the next few videos, right? Because it had to maintain and get that flow. It varies from if you're writing the method to the discussion to the results. So there's every section has a different way of creating and maintaining that flow, and that's something very important we'll look at, and that's something you can only probably learn from examples. Okay, next, clean typing. If it's well organized, the reader will naturally believe that there is a good well quality written text in here. It's a good quality of text, even if it's not. Like, a good organization can make up for bad language. So you want to have a good manuscript, and you want to make it something that suits your own style, but also looks something straight out of, a scientific journal. And so here's the manuscript that I've come up with. So when you're writing normal text, you want to use Cambria 11 or 12 size. For captions, for photos and stuff, and graphs, you want to use Calibri. If you're writing the title, you want to put Cambria in bold with 18 font size. Subtitles, I like using Aptos, and yeah, so that's that. Next, okay, will the reader understand? Your college teachers and professors and everyone that you work with, like everyone in your group, they will understand what you want to say. But here's the thing, the reader will not, because if you're going to jump straight into the specifics, they're going to be like very, they're going to feel very isolated. So you will have, because when you work with your colleagues and they're going to be all well educated about the topic, and they're going to be thinking it from the perspective that you think it, because you're going to tell them the story. But when you write the article, the writer needs to be aware. So you need to be aware that the reader is not as well educated and it doesn't have that much context, doesn't have that much personal context about you as the colleagues. So a written text is therefore not an information repository, nor it is a naturally occurring flow of words and sentences. It is an artifact created for a reader. The aim is not simply to make it possible for the reader to understand. The narrative should be so strong enough to make it impossible for the reader not to understand. So you don't want to just have a flow of words and the reader forgets what they're actually reading. You want to have it so that it's a narrative that they can't not understand. Like if they read it, they should get it the first time. If they read it the second time, their understanding should be further rooted. That's how you want to make it. And this is a quote from a book called Science Research Writing, and that's a book I'd recommend to check out if you're having struggle. And yeah, it helps a lot and also forms the basis of today's presentation. Okay, next. You want to use science as a language. And this is something called narrative rap. Okay, so if you want to communicate your research, you have to use science as a language. Basically, you have two things when it comes to writing a scientific report. You have your framework and your language. So first of all, what's your framework? Your framework is your planning. So this is titles, subheadings, order of graphics, how you want to present the information, how you want to present the captions, how you want to add the images depending on how you're going to refer to them in the text. That's all your framework. That's all your planning, as you can see here in the green area. Now, what is your writing? Your writing is that's the actual body of your framework, right? Of your entire thing. That's what your framework refers to. So here you want to comment on and identify the function of information. And you want to create paragraph, entry, sentences. You want to create phrases. You want to use words such as although, however, that, bring your reader into a direction. And this is something we'll look over because all of these key points are important to understand, and this is something that runs as a motif throughout your entire paper. And so it definitely changes when you're writing the introduction, when you're writing the method. And so this is something we will look at specifically in the next few videos. But these are just key points. These are just things to keep in mind so you don't start overthinking. So planning refers to like how you want to put the images, how you want to structure it, and then writing is how you want to comment on the information. You can use evaluative language. You can say a striking difference, or you can say a subtle difference. And those are the kind of things that you want to have in your writing. So this is how you create that narrative wrap that, wraps the reader into what you are writing about. Now let's look at the strategy for science writing. Okay, you want to build sentence-based, paragraph-based model. So basically what happens is that when you write a paper, it's going to be in a field, right? And there's going to be multiple papers in that field. So you must look at all those other papers in the field, and you want to see how they organize their information. And then what you do is that you create models based on them. So you can say that, for example, this sentence identifies a gap in the research, or this paragraph maps the contribution of this study into the literature. So you want to create those mental annotations, and you can also do that in diagram. And we've done this a lot throughout the next few videos when we look at introductions and all that. And basically, when you have this idea, when you have this structure, all you have to do is take what the structure they've used, and then you can combine structures and stuff and create your own structure, and then you can use that information and put your information into that structure, and that creates something new, something original, but also it is in the conventions of that specific field that you're studying. Okay, second, you want to mine successful text for vocabulary. So again, look at all your texts in that field, and you want to see what kind of words they use, and if you start really early and you have a lot of time, try creating a book or a notebook or a piece of paper. Just on a piece of paper, write down ideas, write down words that they use, write down words that you think are really important and will make you sound connected to that field. So that's how you want to mine them for vocabulary. Because they will use phrases. Let's say they want to say a gap in the research, like there's a gap in the research. They'll use a specific phrase for that. You can copy paste that phrase. You can probably make a few changes over here and there, And then what you do is that makes you sound authentic. Okay, now the third thing, you want to identify and master the relevant grammar, language, and writing skills. You see, when you're writing in that field, when you write a story and when you write a scientific paper, that story and that scientific paper are kind of different, right? You feel that they're different, like the writing styles are different. So a story uses adjectives and descriptive language, and if it wants to describe this pencil, it will use 100 words. Whereas a scientific paper, if it wants to describe this pencil, it will just say, well, look, a red pencil with black stripes, something like that. It just wants to get the message of it. And this is something that happens in different fields in science. So a biology paper, and you compare that to a physics paper, they're going to use different language styles, just like how a story with a scientific paper, a biology paper and a physics paper have different ways of writing. And so when you're writing a specific paper, you also want to go into that field. You want to see how they structure and how they use grammar, language, and writing skills, and then you want to get an idea. And once you have that idea, you can create a paper that also fits their conventions. So the strategy really is study other papers. And if you take a few phrases of other papers, that make sure it's not like facts you're taking, but take phrases, and you can put those phrases in there, and you can sound a bit original. Put them in the original manner, so that you're using good phrases that make you sound smart, that make you sound genuinely smart, but then you're also not copy pasting, because that would be plagiarism. Okay, now let's look at a few rules when it comes to scientific writing. First of all, no need to make it stylish or elegant. The primary aim is to communicate clearly and accurately. Using elegant English may actually make your research article less accessible. When we're writing and we're like, I want to sound smart, or I want to take up space, why isn't this paragraph more than 100 words or something? And we unnecessarily add information that makes it sound elegant. For example, that's just going to make you, sound dumber, right? Because that's something we've said before. So if you're going to try making it stylish or elegant, the reader might think this is a waste of time, and they might leave your paper. Because sometimes what we do is that, let's say I have the word framework, and then I start a sentence and say this framework was blah blah blah, and then the next sentence, when I want to refer to that framework, I'll be like, let's make it stylish and elegant and use another word. And I say, instead of saying this framework, I say this model. And so although I think I'm using words and making it sound, oh look, I'm so smart, but you know what this does? It is very counterproductive. Basically, the reader will think, okay, so there's a framework, there's a model, there's so much to keep in mind, because then they'll start creating differences. They'll think the framework is different from the model, and it will be really difficult for them. However, if I just state it as a framework, and in the next sentence I use the same word framework, what that does, it will create an echo, which enables the reader to recognize and track concepts through the paper. And this is much more effective. Okay, now the second rule. Good organization and good writing can compensate for bad language, but error-free language does not compensate for poor organization or poor writing. When you have good organization and good writing, everything is, the reader can clearly identify what's going on and what important piece of information is where. They'll often neglect the poor language. But if you have extremely good scientific language, if you've mastered it, but the reader can't quickly identify what they want to see, like if they want to know what the paragraph's about, they'll probably look at the first sentence of the paragraph, and if they don't get what the paragraph's about, even if it's written at like the highest top-notch levels, it's not going to compensate for that bad organization. Because in most cases, if your scientific paper is going to be read along with millions of others, the key focus of the person that's deciding which one they want to give the highest mark or which one they want to choose, it's going to be all about how it's organized, because they're going to be skimming it. They're not going to be reading every paragraph in detail, and so they won't have enough time to acknowledge that language, that good language. They will when they select it and then write it. So both of them are important, but in most cases, please focus. And first of all, please focus on having good organization, because otherwise, even if it's good, and it's not presented well, the reader will think that, or the marker will think that this is worthless. So If you have good language, that's good. But before you start, and if you don't have good language, please first focus on your organization skills. Okay, let's look at the next thing. Okay, so key messages. Here are the key messages that we take away. Okay, so first of all, the content of your scientific research should be accessible to all readers. So you want to use language. This is where the language comes in. Not choosing, I want to publish it in this journal or that journal. That's what the language is. Okay, the reader needs to be shown the function of data or information, not just presented with it. Okay, that's the second point. Now C, the aim is not simply to make it possible for the reader to understand. The aim is to make it impossible for the reader to understand. Okay, and fourth, evidence-based guidance can be obtained by studying the structure and language of successfully published papers. So these four messages are what we've looked at before. Now let's look at verbosity. Okay, verbosity is a silent killer. You may think it makes you sound smart, but in reality it doesn't. Basically, first of all, let's look at verbosity. So being overly verbose, which means that you're using too many words. So let's look at this example. Our research designed to test the fatal effects of PGF2 alpha on dogs was carried out by intravenously introducing the drug in the experiments, a relatively small quantity. Like, there's so much that we don't need. Like, relatively small quantity. Like, no, we don't care. We just want the quantity. And intravenously, like, really, the fatal effects. Like, come on, like, most of this information we don't need. Cut it. And so then what happens when we cut it? Intravenous injection of 30 milligrams prostaglandin of PGF2 alpha to each of 10 dogs, killed them within 5 minutes. There we go. Straight, simple, straight to the point. We get all the information. But here's the thing. Don't make it too simple. Like, look at this example. Young, mature, sprague dolly rats, 200 grams, Charles River, Italia, were and then used. Like, come on, what is this saying? What is Charles River, Italia? Is that guy the owner of the rats? What's going on? Do the rats weigh 200 grams? Like, what's going on? What exactly do you mean by young, mature? Like, this, it's too compressed and there's not enough. We don't know what's really going on. And so in this case, you want to increase the amount of words you use. So there's this sweet spot, and in this case, the sweet spot would be the rats used in this experiment were obtained from Charles River breeding laboratories and were derived from sprague dolly strain. The animals were sexually mature, 100 days old, and weighed 190 to 215 grams. See, that's more precise, and if someone's reading this paper, they get so much more information, and especially if it's someone that's really into that field, they'll get so much information from that. So that's something you want to do. Okay, now let's talk about that sweet spot. So you don't want to be too simple so that no one understands what's going on, and you don't want to be too descriptive so that people lose focus really easily. You want to find that sweet spot, and this comes from judging who's going to read your paper. Along with that, you want to see how other papers in that field are organized. If everyone's using, because there's a sweet spot, but it shifts between what field you're looking at. For example, biology probably uses more descriptive language because they have to explain what animal, what the animal was doing, what it looked like, as in the second case. But when you're talking about something like physics or chemistry, there's so many things that are already there, like pendulum. You don't have to say a pendulum swinging slowly or like pendulum swinging tirelessly. Like, no, we don't need none of that. So you want to look at other papers in that field, in that specific field. Like in physics, if you're looking at classical physics, read a lot of classical physics paper and see what their sweet spot is. And that's how you find the correct amount of words in a sentence. Okay? Now, language. There's a lot. There's active and passive voice, there's present and past tense. There's a lot to, look at. And so the passive voice should always be, so let's look at active and passive voice. The passive voice should always be used when writing scientifically. So when you're writing scientifically, no one really gives a damn about who performed that action. Like, I stopped cell growth. Like, look, you stopped the cell growth, no one cares that you did. We stopped cell growth. Like, no one cares. What we care about is the action itself. We don't care about the person performing the action. So when you talk about cell growth and stuff like that, see, in this case, the better one would be cell growth was stopped with. So here we're only focusing on the action. We don't care about the person that performed the action. So that's something that you want to use. Now, if you want to make it sound more succinct, you can also consider using active verbs. Oxygen was consumed by the mouse at a higher rate. See, that takes up more words, but then you can, if you use active verbs, you can say the mouse consumed oxygen at a higher rate. Okay, now present tense and past tense. Present tense and past tense are the only tenses that should be used in scientific writing. Because if you're writing with future tense, something's seriously wrong. Because you wouldn't write about an experiment that you're about to do, and so then there would be nothing to write about in the results, right? So present and past tense. Now, present tense should be used for established knowledge, and past tense should be used for results or actions that you are currently reporting. So this is kind of like how you want to split it. So in the introduction, you use present, methodology, past, results, etc., etc., as you can see. Okay, so now many of us are really confused with what is active, what is passive voice. So now that we've understood this entire slide, many of us are confused with what is active and what is passive voice. Well, first of all, I think many of our main focus should go to writing it in going to getting the tenses right? And then we can focus on active and passive voice, all the voices. And so if you can't write properly, if you can't use present and past tense properly, first focus on that. That's why I wrote just write it in past tense, or I should have wrote just focus on tense. I shouldn't have wrote just write it in past tense. That's a mistake. So focus on your tense first. Get your tense right first, and then focus on everything else. Then focus on your active and passive voice. Now that you want to ensure that everything is right, one thing, just get your tense right, and then stop using the word I. Those are the two things if you're really struggling, those are the only two things that you need to focus on. Get your tense right and stop using I. And then once you're done with that, you can look at passive and active voices and all that, and how that works. But right now, those are the only two things you need to focus on if you're struggling. Okay, the structure. This is how you want to structure your article, and in the next videos and the following videos, we're going to look at each of these, and we're going to look at how you can optimize, how you write in all of these sections. So your abstract is just, a summary of what you want. So usually what happens is that when you're submitting papers for publishing or for a journal, or if you're submitting for industrial users, the people don't have enough time because there's millions of papers. They're not going to read the introduction, method, result, blah, blah, blah. They're just going to read the abstract. And so abstract is if we're talking abstract is, the thing that, sells your paper. So you want to focus on the abstract. That's the first thing. But make sure you write it last, because it's a summary of everything you do. It's basically a summary with spoilers. So it's a summary with the results in the discussion. Next is introduction. So let's say I'm writing a paper about physics. Physics is this broad. I choose classical physics. So I'm in classical physics. Now, I'm not going to write a paper on in the entirety of classical physics. It's going to be something in there, right? It's Newton's third law, let's imagine. So in the introduction, I have to take Newton's third law, and I have to narrow it down. I have to take Newton's third law, and I have to narrow it down to something that I'm going to write about it. So let's say I want to point out a flaw in Newton's third law. So basically, I take Newton's third law, I introduce it on the big level, and then I narrow it down and then present what I'm going to write the paper on. Maybe say it's a flaw, how it doesn't work in space or something, and then that would be my paper. So I'm narrowing it down. So your introduction should narrow all the information down. Then the methods, you say what happened. I'm going to use a lot of diagrams over there. In the results, you want to say what information you got. And when you do that, you kind of want to set it up for the discussion. Because in the discussion, you show the implications, the applications, the importance of your data, and the importance of your insights, as we talked about in the beginning of the video. And so in the discussion, that should be where you kind of bring it back, and then you kind of take that idea and you kind of expand it. So in the introduction, we brought it all in, and now we're going to take it all out. And so basically in the introduction and the discussion are kind of opposites. So now that I've talked about Newton's third law in space, I'm going to bring it back out. I'm going to talk about Newton's third law in general. I took space out, and then I'm going to talk about classical physics. That's a very basic example, not a bad example. And then in the conclusion, I just say what we did and everything, and I kind of bring it to a summary. And what you want to do in the ending parts is that you want to give a clear direction about where your paper is headed. And so that would create the structure of your article. So this is the key structure. In the next video, we're going to look at introduction, how you write the introduction. Till then, I'll see you. And yeah, if you liked the video, I hope you learned something. And yeah, I'll keep trying my best. Till then, keep grinding. You know, when I first started writing scientific papers, my introductions would be just would just be filled with background information on the topic. Let's say I'm writing a paper about concrete, which I was, and if we look at my paper, it would just be like this whole big lesson on what concrete is, how it's made, but I never really state why I needed to do research on it. And so my papers, the rest of my paper would be really meaningless, and you know, I'd look for purpose in the rest of the paper, but you know, that purpose should have been established in the introduction. And so now I've studied, and now when I look at how to actually write an introduction, I realize everything wrong that I was doing. And so now I'm going to share this knowledge with you. And your introduction can really be a game changer, because it not only impacts what your reader thinks, but it also impacts the progression of your paper, how much purpose it can give you. Because my paper on concrete didn't give me much purpose after that. I screwed up the introduction and I wrote just a whole lesson on what concrete is, because that's not what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to make it so that it gave me that purpose, and my paper, rest of my paper didn't fall apart. So the introduction isn't really about the reader, although it is, but it also shapes how your paper actually progresses and how you feel about it at the end. So let's look at the introduction. First of all, this is the key point. So in the introduction, you must look at 3 key points. What was I studying? So the context of the work, the relevant primary research, and the current understanding. So if I was writing about concrete, I'd provide some background information on concrete, like the basics. So I'd narrow the information to concrete. I'd say concrete is one of the most used materials in the world, or one of the most cheapest yet efficient materials in the world, something like that. And then I take it into, I take it and then I outline the relevant primary research and what the current understanding is and all that. So basically, what is already known about the topic you're studying? Okay, now you want to next thing, number 2, you want to identify the gap. Basically, the reason you're conducting a research is because there's something wrong. That you've identified a gap, you've identified something wrong, and so you want to address that. So now you want to include your gap. So what is your purpose? What is the purpose about the topic being investigated? So you're looking at concrete. Now I want to say, let's say I want to talk about the curing time of concrete. I'd say, although the physical properties of concrete are well understood, the chemical properties are not yet as much. And so I then narrow it down to curing time, and I'd say the curing time of concrete has been a long debated question among many engineers, something like that. Not exactly, we've got proper examples later, but I'll identify a gap. And then third, I'll talk about how the study advances the knowledge. So why do we need this research? What are the important real-world implications about the investigation? So for that concrete one, I'd say something like understanding the curing time of concrete is extremely essential, as it will, transform the way we, create concrete, something like that. And so what we've been doing here is that we started off really general. What is concrete? Then we looked at, okay, so let's go into a bit more specific, and then we'll talk about a gap. So why I need to do this research. So now we're going a little specific, and then we're ending it off really specific, and you want to narrow it down by, showing how the study will advance knowledge and what your specific scientific inquiry question is. So here's where you introduce your inquiry question. So the thing you'll be investigating. Okay? So yeah, so in the middle, you want to make a comment, and then you want to narrow it down to that one question. So now what do you do next? So now what are the next key points? So here is the progression of your introduction. At the start, you want to engage the reader. So at the start of the introduction, it is important that the opening sentence enables the reader to jump into your paper. So at the start, you want to provide a general statement that everyone knows, and so everyone can relate to it, and then they can start reading the next sentence. The first sentence should be something really general and something really important. Concrete is essential to the Industrial Revolution, or something like that. Like, it's not actually essential to the Industrial Revolution. That's something I made up on the spot. But yeah, something that people can relate to and then easily grasp as they go through the next of your paper. Now, after that, you want to present the information. You want to show how this information is actually important, and then you want to narrow it down to the gap, right? So you want to create a smooth flow between the engagement and the problem, and so in between them there's a good presentation of the information. And when you present the information, you lead them down the path, and you say concrete is made out of four ingredients, and it has to be set. And this setting time is called curing time. See how I introduced curing time? I could talk about something else about concrete. I could talk about how concrete is, I can talk about the physical properties of concrete. Concrete is and then I can take it into a different stream. But I talked about how concrete is made, and I brought it down to curing time. So that's that presentation in between. Now is where you introduce the problem, because at some point in the introduction, you state the specific problem your study focuses on, or you identify a gap in the existing research, and this will be filled in your paper. So now you want to identify the question, like, although concrete is this, its curing time has not been understood completely yet. Okay, so now you've identified the gap. Now you want to end it. Okay, so now when you end it, you want to create this flow, because although you have subtitles and they identify where you're going, you want the reader to feel as if they're absorbing ideas. So at the end of the introduction, you need to enable your readers to move into the central section, which should be your method. Okay, now what is the importance of your introduction? Let's look at the 5 key points on the side apart from the timeline. What is the importance? In the introduction, you established the importance of the research, and then only the readers, after they know the importance of your research, only then will they be actually interested in your content. And others, they may dismiss your research if they don't understand its true importance. Now, at the start, you want to use a starting fact, and the one I used in this case, the one I'm making up, is concrete is essential to the engineering revolution, or something like that. That's my starting fact. So this starting fact should be the meeting place, because all readers, you're going to have a whole range of readers. You're going to have ones that are really interested, or ones that are just reading for fun because it's in the journal or whatever there is. And so you want to start with a fact that everyone can agree with, even like all the precise engineers and everyone that's just reading it for fun. And so that's going to be the meeting place. That's how they're all going to go into your video. That's how they all get sucked in. So when you find that starting fact, you want to ensure that it is something that everyone can agree with. Now, when you're talking about the background information, so when we talked about, this is the present thing, where you were talking about the background information. And the thing with background information is that you want to present it depending on in which way you want to take your paper. So when you're presenting that, you don't want to provide unnecessary information. Like, you don't want to go into too detail. You can mention the physical properties of concrete, but you don't want to go into too detail about them. So you want to ensure that you fill all the gaps about the stream that you're taking it into. Don't be so focused on everything else that you forget the importance of what you need to actually talk about, what your paper will actually address. So yeah, and as a general rule, it is better to provide slightly too much background information than slightly too little, because you have to imagine that your average reader is one that reads just for fun, or like, it depends on who you're writing the paper, but in most cases it's going to be someone that has a good amount of general knowledge, and they're just reading scientific papers. Or if it's for a teacher, that's the kind of thing you want to assume. So it's better to have a little too much background information than have the reader wondering, so leave no doubts. Okay, citations. When you start to introduce like precise background information, because at the start it's going to be really broad, and then you're going to start to introduce precise background information, and when you start to identify gaps, you want to back it up. You need to back it up in other studies. So if you're identifying a gap, that's kind of like an accusation, right? So you want to make sure that you know where you're getting this information from, because if there's no citations, people might think you're making up the information. And similar with that, when you're using really precise information that people are not very familiar with, like if I'm saying Newton's third law, like I'm studying that, I'm writing about that, everyone can agree with that. I don't need to cite that. I don't need to cite like one of Newton's books, because this is common knowledge. But like if I'm talking about, the pressure of this specific pipe in a dam, then I need to cite that information because I'm getting that from another research paper. Okay, now last one, introduce the issue. So before you describe the specific problem that you will look at in your research paper, you kind of want to lead the reader into it. So you want to ensure that what you're going to talk about is that you want to place it so that it's the current focus of the field. Like, let's say I'm talking about the curing time for concrete. I'd say something like, the curing time for concrete is, although the curing time for concrete is not understood, and this has major implications for the construction industry, because it impacts the amount of time they need to do this and that and blah blah blah. And so that kind of makes the reader feel like this is actually a significant issue, and it's at the center of what everyone is, of the field itself. And when you introduce the issue, you also want to do it using signal words. So you want to say, like, how I used, although the curing time for concrete, although concrete is important, the curing time has not yet been understood. That although kind of hints that this is the gap over here. Because if someone's skimming your paper, they're going to be looking for those kind of signal words like however, although, and that's where they quickly locate, okay, so here's where, the gap is. Here's what this paper is going to address. So yeah. And so that's what you want to do. Another thing, you don't want to be too shy when you're pointing out problems in previous research, because that kind of makes you look, because although you may think that it makes you look dumb, it's not going to make you look dumb, and it's not going to, in fact, it's going to show that you actually understand what you're reading or what you're writing about. And so what it does is that it shows that you're a sensible reader, and it's also not disrespectful if you point out problems in other people's research, because you're not targeting them for their research, you're targeting the research itself. And so it kind of shows it's not disrespectful. Just don't be afraid if you want to point out something wrong with research, because you can say that although this person did this research on curing time of concrete, that was done like 50 years ago, and it's probably not valid today, so we need to do research on it again, something like that. Okay, next, your generic introduction model. So this is kind of everything summed up, and next up we have an example. So firstly, what you want to do is that you want to establish the importance, then you want to provide background factual information, and then you want to present the general problem and the current focus. So that's what we did. Now that you've kind of narrowed it down, you want to present previous and or current research. So now you're going to narrow it down even more, and this is where the citations come in. So now you've narrowed it down to like the really last bit, and here's where you locate a gap in the research. You describe a problem that you will address, and this is how you identify the research opportunity. Now you've identified the problem. Now you want to tell them what the paper will do. So you want to tell them, this is what the paper is planning on achieving. And if we are able to understand this, we can revolutionize this and this in real life. So that's how you model your introduction. And here is an example. So what is this about? This is about a lightweight chitted PLA composite for load-bearing biomedical applications. And as you can see here, is that what they've done is we've split it into the 4 key sections: establish research, locate a gap, and then present the paper. and then we've done and then there's a sentence by sentence breakdown on how the introduction actually works. And this I got from Science Research Writing, second edition by Hilary Glassman Dew. And so if you want more information on this, please check out that book. But this is, the overall structure of how you want to model your introduction. So what I've done is that I've taken this model and I've tried to make it easier for you to understand. I've made a table, and so this kind of contextualizes everything that we've learned. So this is how you write the introduction. Now in the next video we're going to look at how you write the method. So this is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, the next video is going to be on methods. Till then, bye bye. When I first started writing scientific papers, I thought that when you write the method, you write it step by step. And this was because every time, like in school, every time we wrote, a scientific method, we had apparatus and then aim, hypothesis, apparatus, and then the method, and that would be number 1, do this, number 2, do that. And I didn't know that it was different until, I looked at other papers and my teacher kind of clarified it for me. And so I realized that it's really different. When you write the method, it gets really complicated. So today we're going to look at how you can write the method. So this is how you write the methodology. Okay, firstly, let's look at a few key points. Chronological order. Okay, what you want to do is that you want to always write your method in chronological order. Firstly, you don't want to use number 1, this happened first, number 2, this happened first. It should not be a step-by-step protocol. Rather, it should be written somewhat as a recount. So first of all, don't write it, number 1, we did this, number 2, we did that. That's not how it's done. You want to write it as a recount of this is what I did first, then this is what I did, then this, no, not that. You want to do, this was done first, followed by this, after this, blah blah blah. Okay, I hope that's clear. Now, first key point, always write in chronological order. So we have 2 examples here. The red one, cell growth was stopped with hydrochloric acid after incubation for 65 to 70 hours at 37 degrees. Now, if someone was skimming this paper, they'd pick up the keywords. They'd think cell growth stopped with hydrochloric acid, and then it was incubated for 65 to 70 hours at 37 degrees. So they think that cell growth that was stopped and afterwards it was incubated. However, that's not what happened. So when you write your method, you want to make sure that you have it in chronological order as much as possible. So the green example, after the incubation of cells for 65 to 70 hours at 37 degrees, their growth was stopped with hydrochloric acid. Now, if someone's, skimming that paper, they're going to understand everything because they're going to pick up the keywords and they're still going to be right. So first of all, make sure that it's in chronological order. Secondly, you want to make generic statements because imagine you're at a museum, you're not going to, as soon as you see a painting, as soon as you see the Mona Lisa, you're not going to talk about the texture of the paint and the color of the dress and the color of the hair. No, you're going to look at the painting in its whole, and afterwards, after you've looked at the painting, you're going to look at the texture of the paint, the color of the hair, the color choice for the clothes. You're not going to start by looking at those things. And similarly, when you want to look at your method, you want to start by making generic statements. And so when you offer a general view and when you outline the parameters of work, what you're doing is that you're creating this, similar to how you did with the introduction, you're creating this very large, space, and this is where the reader can, easily grasp. And once they've grasped onto those pieces of information, they'll slowly look at the details. So let's say you used a pendulum that you modified in some way. At first, you wouldn't start with a modified this pendulum was blah 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 was used for this. You'd say a pendulum was used for this. And then in the second sentence, you talk about how the pendulum was modified. So when you make generic statements, your reader feels that it's really easy to grasp on, and then you can easily lead them into more specific statements. So how can you actually start your method? So you want to first, you can offer general views by discussing parameters. Then you want to provide information about the source of the materials, equipment, etc. So if you collected, samples from a dam, you can say dam samples were collected from here, because that's where most scientific researchers have collected them from, blah blah blah. Or you can refer back to something before in the paper, like the aim. So to address the aim, the method was modified, something like that, Next, key points. So now we've looked at that first set of key points. Okay, now when you talk about your method, you have to include background information, because you don't know how much your reader knows about your topic. So there's two things I want you to consider when you're talking about your method. If you go straight into let's say it's a very basic paper and you're talking about radiation, and you say this many hertz of radiation, blah blah blah, but the paper this paper, that's the target audience that this paper is targeted towards, they don't even know what radiation means. So what should you do? First of all, you should kind of define radiation. This is something you should have done in your introduction, and then you want to, let's say you use some radiation monitoring machine. You first want to describe that radiation monitoring machine. So you'd say this brand radiation monitoring machine was used at this intensity, blah blah blah. So there's two things you have to consider when providing background information to ensure that you don't give too much detail and not too little detail. What can all potential readers be assumed to know about this method in general? And what do they all need to know in order to understand your specific method? So you need to find that sweet spot between them. Where can I provide background information that's not too much or too less? Okay, next, you want to explain your choices. So in your method, you probably made your own method, or you modified someone else's method from a different experiment. And it's important to state the reasons for the choices you make. You must justify them via factual information, because your reasons, the reasons why you modified the pendulum or you used this X-ray monitoring machine, something like that, are obvious to you. But the reader will question, why did they do this? Or why did they do this specifically? They could have done it the other way. And so if you explain it, that kind of strengthens, that kind of creates a connection with the reader, and they're like, okay, exactly, this is why this was done. And so they feel that they're following this flow, they're absorbing ideas, going back to this key point of absorbing ideas. But if you don't explain why you made certain choices, your readers will find it hard to accept the method, and this will eventually affect the way you study. Okay. Detail in methods. Basically, always be wider and more interdisciplinary than when you think when writing about methods. It's good to include citations if your method is based on that of another researcher, but also explain it in your own words. So you want to, as I said before, you want to justify, and so you want to do this by, if you've got your research if you've got your method from somewhere else, you want to cite them, but then you also want to say what that method is. You want to provide a general view. So you want to justify it is one of the key aspects of the method. That's that key point where your reader will make that connection, will feel as if they're absorbing ideas, because if you're able to justify, they'll feel that everything is evidence-based. Okay, now fourth, you want to use chronological words. So in most cases you're going to be like, this was done, then this was done, blah, 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 blah. But it's not gonna, it's gonna become very repetitive, and so it's going to be harder for the reader to pick up on ideas, because you're kind of breaking that flow if you're going to use the same words. It sounds very repetitive. So you want to use chronological words. So if you're talking about before the beginning, you want to say beforehand, earlier, at the beginning, at first, at the beginning, steps, order. So there's this list that you can refer to if you want, and you can also use your own words. Okay, now your weaknesses will make you look stronger. The last point. So if there's any problems in your method or limitations, it's good to include them, because you can refer to those back in your discussion and you can talk about them. That becomes a talking point for discussions. And in many cases, like if you don't have enough resources, or if you're limited, people might use that as a direction for their research. They can do your research with a more valid method, and that can shape their research, right? And another aspect is, if your problems are linked to discrepancies in the results, you're ultimately able to talk about it when that happens, and you don't have to pull it out of nowhere or say that you don't know how it happened. So your weaknesses will make you, give you more points to talk about, and they will be able to, progress, give your paper a direction for research. They'll create this continuum, and people will be able to make further research on it. And another thing is that it also shows truthfulness. It also shows transparency, which is, something that it's not going to be that obvious when you write the paper, but people will think something is fishy if that entire paper went perfect, especially if it's, not from like a really high performing team of top scientists. Okay, so here is the generic method model. At first, you want to provide an overview of statements about the methods. Then you want to restate the aim, the gap from the introduction. And look, you can modify this as you go, because you want to modify the models based on how other papers in the field are written. Then you want to describe the give the source of materials and equipment used. In the second point, you want to provide details. And here's where you justify your choices, and here's where you indicate if you took proper care or not. Then you want to describe discuss the content of a figure or a table. So here's where you say how that experiment was, how a table was derived from your experiment. So if you're throwing a ball, you could say that motion tracking app was used. Then you want to kind of refer to materials or methods in other studies, like if you've taken one of their methods, or why did you do this. A good way to justify your choices is showing that other papers have done it as well, and people can often think if this is a common way of doing it, why not? And then you want to provide background information if necessary, and then at last you want to indicate issues or problems, because then you can talk about them in the discussion, so you're creating a flow. Now let's look at an example. Okay, this person, a method to analyze levels of dissolved CO2 in pristine groundwater. See, I took this example and I tabulated it. If you want to see the actual example and stuff, look at Science Research Writing 2nd edition. But here's table version. Okay, at first they provide an overview of the method, the current investigation. Then they provide background information. This region in the Midwestern United States, and look, as they say, they justify and they cite. Wells in this area, look at 2, and then look at section 2 and the first sentence in that. Wells in this area have been frequently used to interpret groundwater evolution. And so that's good justification. You're justifying your choices. And then you're going to state the numbers. Here's where you use numericals, 18 3 milliliter samples, and then prior to collection. See, that's a chronological word. That's a time word. That's when you're saying that this happened before this, and that's a key, part of that key list I gave you. And then you want pH levels were monitored, and then you want to describe what was done in detail. So now you're kind of bringing them in. That's the blue section. The sample bottles were transferred to amber glass bottles, which are sealed tightly, blah blah blah. And then you want to provide more details. So kind of this model, is adjusted to the field it's in. And so that's something you want to do. Here they flipped 4 with 3, and then they have 3 samples were shipped directly to 2 separate. And then 5. This method uses a carbon analyzer, blah blah blah. Provide this. Now they're providing more information. And then 6, they mention a limitation. All filters used for glass or stainless steel, although 2 samples were at risk of CFC contamination. So now, let's say I'm reading this paper and I'm like, oh, What happens if there was a risk of CFC contamination? What happens if those two samples were contaminated and they mucked up the entire data? Oh look, I've just got, a new way of research. I can redo the experiment with much better equipment, and I can say, hey look, if there is a change, and that could be my scientific paper. Yeah? Okay, and see, this is how you write the method. And so this is, the generic method model. In the next video, we're going to look at how to present your results. And so, yeah, this is how you write the method, and I hope you enjoyed this video. And yeah, till then, keep grinding. Bye-bye. When I first started writing papers, and I had a basic idea, but I didn't know that much. I had to write the results, right? And I had this big chunky table, and I'm like, if I put this entire big chunky table into my results, I'll look extremely smart, I'll look super smart. And here's the thing, they only gave us 1 page allowance for the results section. So I filled my entire, half of my 1 page with just this big chunky table, and then I was like, okay, now let me put a graph in there. But you know what ended up happening? I didn't have enough space. So now I go up to the teacher and I tell her that, look, I don't have enough space. And she tells me, well, you dummy, you don't need 1 entire page for that, chunky table. You can cut out points. You can provide a summary table. And so, there's so many things when it comes to writing results, because although it may just be graphs and tables, you want to present it really nicely. And so, this video, we're going to look at how to make your results, how to write, a good, results section. Okay. So let's get straight into it. So your results should be composed of 2 main things. At first, you want to give an overall description of your experiments. You want to provide, that big picture without repeating the experimental detail. So since you are providing that big picture, you want to provide a rough idea of how the data would behave if the hypothesis was true, was or wasn't true. So you can say something like, ideally, if the results support the hypothesis, then these values, blah, 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 additionally this, that. So you want to give the results, but along with that, you want to give this overall description of the main things in those results. You don't just want to give them a bunch of graphs. You want to, focus on the key things that will be part of your discussion, because you're going to talk about your results in your discussion. So you want to start, discriminating. You want to be really selective. You want to start selecting the key points of data, because you're not going to use all of it. You're going to only need some key points, and that's where you use those points and you start writing about them. You start giving that overall description. Okay, so when you do write that description, you have to be selective with what you include and what you leave out. So if I'm writing about, concrete and the curing time of concrete, and I say, this is what I used, this is the ratio of what was used to make the concrete, and I provide this whole long description of this and that, and useless information, and nothing about the curing time of concrete. In the discussion, I'll have nothing to talk about other than, all that useless information about how the physical properties of concrete and blah, blah, blah. So in the results, if I talked about the curing time of concrete, and I said, this is the graph for how much it cures, and as you can see, there's a striking, increase after this many days. That kind of creates a good structure for my discussion. So here you want to be really selective with what you include and what you leave out, because you're creating that structure for your discussion. And you want to use representative data rather than endlessly repetitive data. So this is my mistake. I just put that whole chunk of table, that whole big chunky table, without actually thinking if we actually needed it, because you kind of got the idea when you looked at the first 5 or 6 table sets of values. And there I was with this endlessly repetitive data. It doesn't make you, look really smart or anything when you have this really big chunk of data. But you know what you can do? You can write that, hey, check logbook page 79 for the entire data set. And so you're referring to that entire data set. Or you say check appendix. That's up to you. And so you're not wasting space in your results section, and you want to make sure that the person gets the key idea across. You just don't want to bombard them with numbers. And finally, the key thing you want to remember is clarity. You don't want to just use words that like make you sound smart, and this is something that we've discussed in the key points video. Let's look at what's next. More key points. Redundancy. Never write about components of the data that are already clear. When you provide that description, you're going to have to write about components of the data, but don't write about the obvious things that this happened because of this, blah blah blah. Like x is proportional to y. As x increased, y did as well. This highlights that there's a proportional relationship. That is so much useless information. I can just see a graph and oh look, it's proportional. X, y, proportional. Wow. I don't need like this whole 2-sentence long to tell me that. Like, let's say it's like really, let's say something that I have a graph of this nature. It goes straight and then dips. We say there's a striking dip. Something that is more useful to say. I can say there's a striking dip at this x value, and so that is actually useful information rather than making a general statement that there's a proportional relationship. Now, if you kind of need to make those statements to talk about something else in your results, please go ahead, but don't make your first sentence that basic information that the reader can see too long. You can put it into one phrase. There was a proportional relationship between x and y. None of that as x increased, y increased, hence showing that there was a proportion. No, only do that with the things that really matter. Don't show your reader what they already can see. So yeah, because sometimes we think that I need to use up words now because it's not looking that as if I'm using so many words. And what ends up, we just fill it with useless words, and you think now look smart, and in the end we exceed the word count, and then you're like, oh, I shouldn't have added those extra words over there because I exceeded the word count anyway. So yeah, you don't want to start using redundant words early on because you'll regret it later. And another thing you want to do is you want to revisit your other papers to ensure that there's a good flow from the method, because in the method you also did this. So to ensure you can watch the method video, it is reader friendly to revisit those studies mentioned earlier. So you talked about the method of other studies, and then you can talk about the method of your study, and you can create that connection. And then later on in the results, you can talk about the results of the other study and the results of your study, and then again create that connection. So this can be very reader friendly. Okay. In the beginning, show and describe the key piece of data, the table, graph, anything. So, if someone's skimming your paper, they only want the key thing, right? They don't want all the useless in other tables before, like, they're not useless, but they don't want the other tables that you're not going to talk about a lot at the start, right? They want the most striking, the graph that you personally know that is the most important, right? Because the reader doesn't know which graph is the most important, and so you have to present your information in a way. So you want to make the reader know, along with your text and the way you position that frame and the text, and you want to combine them to emphasize that, oh look, this is important, focus on this. And so yeah, in the beginning you want to show that key piece of data. The second thing is you want to create a frame. It changes your game. So when I talk about frame, is that how are you gonna position your photos and stuff, and your graphs? How are you gonna position those descriptive words? Are you gonna break them apart, or are you just gonna have one chunky paragraph of that, or are you gonna break it apart depending on where the graphs are? So that's something you want to focus on. So this links back to the last point. You want to give the most important graph at the start. That's your frame. You're creating a frame, because now the reader will subconsciously think that, oh look, this is the most important graph, I'll focus on this first, and all their focusing energy will go into that graph for that section, for the results section. Okay, now you want to find patterns with other research in the field. It reinforces and allows the reader to place your research on a map. So if you can say similar results were achieved by this research, what it does is that now there's a pattern. And don't make that pattern too specific. Like, don't make it like this value was associated with that value, and like there was only a 0.05 blah blah blah. Like, no, not that too specific. That of course depends on the field there, but you can make general statements like a similar gradient proportional relationship was seen in this research 2010 or something. And so that's your kind of, it reinforces your paper. And what it allows the reader to do is that they can subconsciously think that, okay, so I've read that original paper, and I've read like other papers that this person is citing. I believe that in that map, this is where the paper I'm currently reading would fit. Okay? And sixth, you want to use evaluative language. You want to show them what you want them to see. Because look, as I said, you want to create the frame. The reader doesn't know what the most important piece of information is, what's going to be discussed in the discussion, but you do. And so you want to start reinforcing it from the beginning, from the results. So look at this graph over here. So if you write, as can be seen in figure 3.1, the two curves are very similar. You will focus on the similarity because you've been told about the similarity. But then if you write, as can be seen in figure 3.1, the two curves are significantly different, you will only notice the difference between them. And so you want to do that. You want to use evaluative language. You know, to push your reader in the direction that you want them to go, in the direction that your discussion is. Okay, next. Okay, you want to use exclamatory language because this also changes, the perception that your reader has. Because you're not going to be able to use exclamation marks or onomatopoeia like they do in narrative stories, but you need to show, oh look, this is extremely important. And so you want to use exclamatory language. Like, let's say there was a change at 9 a.m. in temperature. You're going to think, okay, yes, there was a change. Or similar, you're just going to think this, or like 8 a.m., 9 a.m., boom, change. But then if I say there was a striking change between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m., this is what you're going to think. That's how much it changed. And so, exclamatory language should be used to emphasize what you're trying to say, emphasize the graphs. And another thing with exclamatory language, if you say striking change, the reader will look at the graph and they will find that striking change. Now, problems. You want to talk about problems in, your results, because problems show character, but don't overemphasize them, because problems are something you talk about in your discussion. And so when you talk about those problems, you want to not overemphasize them, but mention them. And when you mention them, you want to mention them in a way that, shows that it's not that big of a problem, or shows that you know what caused the problem and how it could be solved. Like, you could say the striking temperature drop at 9 a.m. was unexpected, and it was most likely caused by this. See, I'm using modal language. I'm saying it was most likely caused by. And so I'm putting, I'm adding kind of opinion into that scientific paper. And so it shows, first of all, the fact that you're mentioning that shows that, as a scientist, you know how to write a scientific paper. You're well known with all the methods and things. But then you're also showing that you know why it happened and you've done your research. Now, when you end off the results section, you want to end it off with a brief idea of the implications and explanation for the data. So you want to start creating that. If you check the flow diagram in the first video in the series, the key points video, what you'll see is that the results is very loosely touched to the discussion. And so when you end off your results, you want to do it so that it's nice and it flows nice with your discussion, and it's not too abrupt. So you can make this, you can make this really striking. You can make this flow really obvious, or you can make it really subtle. That's up to you, and that's up to how other papers in that field are designed. Now, in the last slide, we talked about evaluative language and how you can use that to make the reader believe what you want them to. And so here are a few words that, are evaluative language words. So a great deal of, a few, a little, a number of, abundant, appreciable, hardly, high, in some cases, large, less, those words. Okay. Next. Now, how do you model your results? So the key model is divided into 4 sections. You want to revisit literature aim prediction. So you want to start by creating that flow. Then you want to make a general statement about the results. And then you want to invite them. This is where your frame comes in. You want to invite them to view the graphic or the content of graphic. In the second section, you want to go into the specifics of the key results. And here's where you use evaluative language to make the reader to focus, to lead the reader into the discussion. Now you're starting to create that flow into that discussion. You want to compare it with other studies, and then if there are any, and then you want to explain why these results happen. So you can say the motion of the ball, the results were tracked in a parabolic motion due to the force applied when the ball was thrown. Like the movement of the ball occurred in a parabolic motion because the force applied when the ball was something like that, but you don't want to go into too much detail, because if you're going to talk about it in your discussion, you want to leave some for that as well. Okay, and then in the third section, you want to look at problems and issues. And you don't just state the problems and issues, you give results and reasons. Fourthly and lastly, you want to give possible implications of results. So now the fourth point kind of leads into the discussion. So this is where you're creating that flow. Let's look at an example. Alright, this example is on bicycle exposure to particulate pollution using portable device for accurate measurement. This I got from Science Research Writing, 2nd edition. Go check that book out. It's really good. And what I've done is that I've tabulated it. And so I've contextualized it so now that you can understand it even better. So at first the writer repeats or revisits the method, then they briefly summarize the method used in the study. You don't want to spend too much time on that. Look at other papers and how they do it in your field, and if they don't do it, don't waste your time. Okay, now you want to invite them to read the graphic. This is where you're going to create, that frame. This is where you're going to lead your reader into where you want to take them in the discussion section. Now you want to compare the results with others. See, now you're kind of giving the reader the ability to contextualize your paper with that of all of the others in the field. Now you want to direct your reader to your most important part, and you want to use evaluative language over here. That's the second point in the second section. Now the third point in the second section is the writer selects a specific result and they present it even more detail. So now you're kind of taking them into this specific direction. At every point they're taking them into the direction that they want them to go into. Finally, in the second point, the writer mentions a possible implication. Now, in the third section, the writer mentions a possible limitation. Now, look how they do it. The presence of vegetation is known to slightly alter BC and NO2 concentrations at different times of day, and the effect of this along the two routes was not investigated. Now, you may think, where's the reason? But they haven't provided the reason, but they've minimized its impact. They've used evaluative language. They said is known to slightly alter BC and NO2 concentrations. They could have said the presence of vegetation is known to alter BC, and that would have made a big difference. But they said slightly, and that that's what makes the difference. Finally, the writer focuses the reader's attention away from the problem and towards the positive value of this study. This in terms of the implications and implications. Nevertheless, the data obtained here suggests that using a portable emissions measurement system to measure BC and NO2 exposure will provide more accurate information for traffic management strategy. So now you're creating that flow. As I said, the last section is creating that flow, and that's what we're doing over here. And so this is how you write your results section. And it's not only about writing, it's also about creating that frame and how you want your information to be presented, and how you can lead your reader into what they need to see and what you're going to talk about in your discussion. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. In the next, we're going to look at discussion. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video, that's very good, and I hope you learned something. Till then, bye bye. Keep grinding. Your introduction and your discussion are the two sections that are so content heavy. This is where you have to write for yourself. It's not like the results section where you can, just put a graph or just put it in the table and the reader can, analyze it for themselves. This is your introduction and your discussions is where the reader, really gets to know you as the author of the scientific paper, as the scientist themselves. And so it's very important that these, sections are very neatly written and show your true self as that scientific writer, and you can get that message across really well. And so there's so much when it comes to writing a discussion, as there is with nearly every other section about in the scientific report. And it's really important that you don't mess this one up, as well as the introduction, because here you're creating that connection with the reader. And so those are the two key important sections. And if you look at, and I used to, I didn't understand this. And so whenever I wrote scientific papers, like I wrote one on bridges, truss formations, and this is what it looks like. This is what my discussion section looks like. First of all, I printed it on yellow paper, which is something you should never do. And if you look closely, this is my discussion section. And what I've done here is that I've placed a graph. So look, I didn't know. This should have gone in the results section, right? The graph. And if you look at the language, some of it's good, some of it's extremely trash. And so I can't create that connection with the reader that I want to. And so this is the place where the reader really gets to know me. And this is one of those important, concepts. And this is what I'm doing. I'm putting images of graphs in this. And my language is not very good. And it's written on yellow paper. So there's so much improvement that needs to be done, and there's so many concepts that need to be understood when writing a discussion. And today I'm going to share those concepts with you, what it takes to write a discussion. Okay, let's get straight into it. Key points. First of all, it's important to understand, how I said the introduction and the discussion are really close and really where the reader gets to know you. Well, luckily, they're also the exact opposites of each other. And so in the introduction, how I said you start off broad, and you can refer to the introduction video. You start off broad and then you go in narrow, and you want to start off with the field or topic. If you're talking about classical physics, start with classical physics, then go to the existing research and knowledge, then identify your gap. What are you addressing? Then go specifically into your paper and your study. And when you get to the discussion, you want to do the exact opposite. So here you're coming in from the field and you're linking it to your paper. Here, you want to link your paper to the field in the discussion section. So you start with your paper, then you address the response or the problem, then you want to map your study to existing research and knowledge, then you want to talk about your contribution to the field. So I start off by talking about classical physics. I'll begin with classical physics. I'll, take a small section, astronomy, in my introduction. Then I'm going to identify a gap in astronomy. I'll say Newton's universal law of gravitation does not apply on planets, even though it does. And then in the discussion, I'm going to talk about what my paper talks about. Then I'm going to say this is why Newton's universal law of gravitation does not apply to planets. Then I'm going to map it to the existing research and knowledge in the astronomy field. And then I'm going to talk about how I contributed to the entire field itself. And so this is, a model that you need to keep in mind. Like, take a screenshot of this. This is extremely important. So now let's look at the key points, like the key things that you want to ensure when you're writing the discussion section. And so it doesn't turn out looking something like this. Okay, first of all, you want to identify the purpose, identify the impact of your research, because there's so many different types of aims and hypotheses, and your paper is not going to be the same. You're not going to be addressing the same type of question as someone else's paper. So there are 4 key impacts of your research. First of all, you obtained identical or similar results to other studies with a modified and improved method. So you modified an improved method and you obtained similar results to other studies. So then what will your main contribution be? You want to find your main contribution. Here, your main contribution is the method. Secondly, you obtain better results than other studies. Here, you did something to obtain better results than other studies. Your results are more precise. Your main contribution are the results themselves. Thirdly, you've been a game changer. You've revolutionized the field of study, and so then your main contribution is the impact that you've had on the literature or research world. Fourthly, you've identified or created new applications in the real world. So here, your main contribution would be the industry itself. And this is something that's really common in fields like civil engineering, where they have to, find applications of concrete, let's say, or find applications of structures or bridges or something like that. And so those papers, are directed to the industry. And that's why that's a very common, use of purpose of scientific papers. Okay, second key point, never claim priority. Don't try and be the best. Basically, if you try and show that you're intellectually superior and you say, our study was the first to have done this, or our study was the first to have done this, it only ends up making you sound dumb. Because imagine boasting in real life, and you're talking with a group of people and you're boasting towards them, like, look at me, I've achieved this and that and that. No one wants to hear that. You just want to state your implications, state your insights. And if the insights are really good, other scientific papers will acknowledge it in the form of citing your paper. And so you don't want to ever claim priority. You don't ever want to show that you're the best. You want to prove it. Prove that why your paper, has something different. And if it does, and that doesn't mean go and state it. You want to have, really good insights, a really good discussion section, just claims priority. So never explicitly claim priority, but show why, your paper, please try and make your paper be good. Show that your paper is good, and you'll get, that priority from other people in that field, and they'll cite your paper. Okay, citations to mention similar insights. When you're talking about discussions, right, you're providing insights on the results. So you're talking about what the results have to offer and what we can learn from them. And in most cases, other people have probably gotten similar results, not exactly point results that, oh, this increased by 2.5%, and the other result says, oh yes, this increased by 2.5% as well. Not those specific kind of results, although that depends on the nature of the paper. But you could, say a similar trend, a similar proportional trend was noticed in this paper published this, right? And so what that does is that it reinforces your paper. It makes your paper sound more reliable to your reader, and they'll, start trusting your paper even more. Even if they don't visit those papers, those other cited papers, they'll think that, look, this person's paper, they've done the research, and I think they're pretty credible, even if they don't visit the other papers. Now, don't unnecessarily repeat the results. Use brackets instead. When we're writing about insights on the results, we'll often spend 1 or 2 sentences saying the results themselves, and then we'll talk about the insights. Now, there's limitations on how much pages and how many words you can spend on each section. So spending too many words or taking up too much space for stating the results, that's only going to waste the amount of time, the amount of space or words you have to, actually talk about the insights. So never waste, don't repeat the results in the discussions, because the aim of your research is not simply to obtain and describe results. It is to make sense of those results in the context of existing knowledge, and to say something sensible and useful about their implications. So what you want to do here is that instead of unnecessarily repeating the results, you want to shorten it. If you have to use it, shorten it, but don't repeat your results, because you're taking up unnecessary space. So let's look at some phrases you can use. As you can see here, the first point on the second slide is that these are a few key phrases that you can use: as hypothesized. Now, what does this phrase "as hypothesized" achieve? This, when you say "as hypothesized, this happened and that happened," what you're doing is you're starting at the introduction and your method, where you first stated the hypothesis. When you say "as hypothesized," you're going straight back there, and then people will say, as they hypothesize. Okay, so then let me check the results. Is it really happened how it hypothesized? So you're connecting your introduction with your results, and now as you're writing this in your discussion, you're connecting everything. So using these phrases helps combine your paper and helps it sound more whole. It makes it feel, it creates this flow, which is really important in scientific writing. So use some of these phrases. Also come up with your own. And so these really, take less space and they connect your paper. So they take less space and they don't compromise on the flow. Secondly, your language should reflect your confidence. Like, let's say you want to make a claim, but you're not that, confident on what you're talking about. Let's say you want to say something about, let's say you found an insight in the data and you want to talk about it, but you're not that confident. Then talk about it. Don't say that if I'm not confident, I'm not going to talk about it. Still talk about it, but use language to, show confidence. If you're sure that this is the insight, that this is a key insight and this has to have happened, then say this is related to. And if you're not that confident, say something like this could be related to. Change your modality and change your confidence when talking about concepts that you understand or don't understand. So change your language depending on how much you understand the topic you're talking about. Okay, position your limitation in the discussion based on context. Now, when it comes to writing the discussion, always talk about the limitations that you've had. Because let's be honest, when we start writing the scientific method for a scientific paper, we're going to write a method, we're going to do the experiment, and then we're going to be like, oh, I could have done this better. And then we're going to do the experiment again, and there has to be one point where we stop and we're like, okay, I can't keep redoing the experiment. I have to work with the data that I have collected yet as of this time. And so there's always going to be improvements, but at one point you're going to have to start writing the rest of the paper. And so here you want to position your limitation. So there's always going to be limitations, so always write about your limitations. And the second thing that you want to do is that, let's say your limitation gives you scope for research. Let's say the limitation that you had, or you think can fuel future research. So what you do here is that you position that limitation towards the end. And because when the reader reads your paper, the last thing that sticks with them is the limitation. Let's say you wanted to prove something about astronomy and you did an experiment here on Earth. Now you're going to say the fact that I did it on Earth is my limitation. Now what is the reader going to do? Since it's at the end, they will think about it, and if they can, they'll do that research in space and they'll publish another paper linked to your research. And so they've used your limitation as a direction. On the other hand, let's say you had some improvements to the method. Let's say your way of releasing the pendulum wasn't ideal. So you could say, I could have released it. So when you're talking about in your discussion section, when you're at the early stages of your discussion section and you're talking about how the results were related to the insights, you can talk about how this limitation impacted your results. So you want to position your limitations based on where you are at in your discussion. And so this kind of leads into the next point. Try and end with a key limitation or application. This can fuel further research. So when you end with a limitation, you're setting a direction. You're telling the reader that, look, this is where I want to take this paper. And if you have those serious readers, they'll do something with your information. They will take it in a direction. Thirdly, provide background information. In most cases, you think of improvements or see them after you complete the experiment. The thing is, read this. The thing is, you're always going to want to add improvements, but it isn't practical. And I've mentioned this before. You're going to do the experiment and you're going to be like, oh, I could have done this better. Oh yeah, I should have done this. And then at one point you just have to move on. You can't keep focusing on what you could have done better, because then there's going to be no due date. You're going to keep on researching. There's going to be no end to your research. So you want to provide background information. So let's take a look at this deeply. Let's say you're talking about a specific point. Let's say you're talking about a specific limitation. Let's just take the example of a pendulum. Now there's two key ways that I know when it comes to releasing a pendulum. You put your hand, the pendulum's here, you release it, and the pendulum swings. But the thing is, when I release it with my hand, I subconsciously add a little push to it, which mucks up my results. Now another way I can do is that I can have a pendulum, I attach it to a string that's attached to a retort stand, and the pendulum is tied with that string. What I do is I burn that string, and when that string burns, the string cuts and the pendulum starts moving. And here there's no additional push. So when I talk about my method, I'm going to say the pendulum. In the method section, I'm going to say the pendulum was released released with my hand. But then in my discussion section, I'm going to provide background information. I'm going to refer to that, that extra string and that burning mechanism. And I'm going to provide background information on that. And then I'm going to link it to my discussions. So it may seem odd, but if you need to, add background information into your discussion section because it's important. Okay, these are some examples over here of limitations. To mitigate such error, it is recommended to change the release mechanism such that the pendulum is suspended by a thread. Not only is this a widely used testing mechanism used in, then refer to a paper, but also increases the validity. The motion of the satellite can be applied to other physical contexts, most notably in Newtonian mechanics. Satellite movement is related to Newton's universal law of gravitation, where, and then you state the formula and you go. So these are kind of like the things. This is where you have to provide background information. See, look at these examples. And so, although it may not seem important in your introduction and your method, you might realize, look, this is important, but not too important to put into discussions or not needed yet. And this is where I need them, so I'll provide that. So this is how the examples show how you put background information into your discussion section. Next. Okay, how do you model your discussion? There are 9 key things. Announce the structure or content of the discussion section. State the achievement or contribution of the study. Revisit background information, literature, to reboot the reader. That's another reason why you want background information. Revisit gap aim method, so why you did the research. Revisit results and explore their implications. We've talked about this. Map to literature. So, how I constantly say, if you check the results, if you check the previous videos, I say that you want to lead your reader in a direction. And that's where they, get that idea. And in the discussions, you want to take them on that journey. And when you're taking them on that journey, they can put your paper into a specific context. As in this case, look, they map to literature, knowledge for comparison or support. They'll put your paper alongside other papers and say, I think here is a good place for this paper to sit along with, let's say, this paper on biology and that paper on biology. I find this place. So you want the reader to be able to place your paper in a context of other papers, of other scientific papers. 7, identify potential limitations and suggestions for future work. This is where you're giving them that direction for those serious readers. Restate the achievement, contribution, impact of the study, and identify potential applications. So always end on a happy note. Let's look at an example. Example, an assessment of post-read 2D sequelae in disease survivors. Now, you can check the sources for this and for more information, for more detail. But what I've essentially done here is I've taken this example and I've put it into a tabulated form and I've color coded it so it's easier. And as you can see, how those categories that we looked at in the previous slide are put into here, and how the writer has used them. And we can see the purpose of each sentence. This is a sentence by sentence breakdown. So at first, to our knowledge, blah blah blah, larger study of patients' viral disease V2D and provides a key contribution to the. So see, the writer explicitly identifies the contribution. So you start with a bang. You start with the importance of your research. Then the writer identifies a specific novel feature of the study. So now you want to go into that specific feature that your paper was all about. Our study is the first to record a wide range of post-V2D and provides clear evidence that survivors who experience a given symptom during V2D are also present within 300 days following the infection. Now, in the next section, the writer revisits the results. This was particularly true in relation, some hearings, blah blah blah. See, as you can see here, the writer wants to specifically, is giving that space for the reader. Now the reader will be like, okay, so this was particularly true. Let me look back to that figure. They're not going to look back to any other figure. They're going to look back to figure 1, as you can see in the third sentence. A key finding, so they revisit the results. Then the writer mentions the potential application. So this has clear implications, blah blah blah, for related public health matters. Suggest that when resources are limited, cardiac screening priority could be given to adults. So this is the potential applications in the health industry. And then the writer mentioned the limitation of the study. So what went wrong? Although how this was not just formally during the study that led to problems. Okay, eighth, the writer mentions background factual information in the literature is known to persist upon the conclusion whilst also restating it. So now they've looked at background information, and you can see in that sentence they've used the word is known to persist. Now they're going to background information. And this the reason they're stating this background information is because it links to their applications and their implications, which they wouldn't have needed to talk about when in the method. And because they need to talk about the implications and applications in the discussion, they think that this piece of background information is essential for the readers to know about. So V2D RNA is known to persist in the bodies of survivors long after the disease onset, and the results of our study provide compelling evidence that follow-up all convalescent patients is warranted for at least 10 months after discharge from hospital. And then you want to end on a positive note, as I said before. The writer closes strongly with the application of the study. In addition, the study provides evidence-based guidance for blah, 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 blah. Okay, now the one thing that I don't like about this example is if you look at the second sentence. Our study is the second sentence. Our study is the first to record a wide range of post-V2D complications. So I think for this paper it might have been necessary, because this is something that this paper is something that is out of my academic radar. And so when it says our study is the first to record, I don't like this idea of claiming priority, but I think it might have been needed for this research paper. And so yeah, post V2D complications, I think that would have been, if in this case it was a key need in this paper to talk about the post complications, and so they had to mention that it was the first to record it, and that kind of makes up for why there were no citations in that section. But yeah, don't unnecessarily boast. If your paper is one of the first to do something, and that's the key quality about your paper, then I guess you can talk about it, but don't use it for unnecessary boasting that we were the first to do this. So yeah, and this is how you write your discussion section. I hope you've learned something and you've enjoyed the video. Okay, now in the next video we're going to look at how to write the conclusion of your paper, and then after that the abstract. So I hope you've learned something. I hope you found this useful. Yeah, and I hope you've enjoyed the video. Keep grinding, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. The conclusions is that phase when it comes to writing reports. It's one of those phases where you're so relaxed because you've done all the chunky things. Now you're finally up to the conclusion, and you're so relaxed. And I think this has an impact on the quality that we give in our conclusions, because we focus so much of our energy onto those key sections that we kind of undermine the conclusion. And you have to remember that the conclusion is the last piece of text, nice last chunk of text that the reader will actually engage with before they leave the paper. And so it's really important that you leave a good impression. So how do you write the conclusion? How do you perfect the conclusion? And so today we're gonna look at a few key concepts. And since the conclusion is really short, there's not many key points when it comes to writing the conclusion, but I do say that we'll still look at examples, and we'll look at how a good conclusion is made. So let's get straight into it. Okay, key points. The conclusion is the summation of all experimental findings in the context of the aim, and it also should address the hypothesis. And remember, the experiment does not necessarily have to address the hypothesis. So you want to have this summation of all your experimental findings. So it's a small recount of each section in your report, and then you sum up with all your experimental findings. But another thing is, you don't want to make this sound bleak. I believe that at every stage of writing a scientific report, you want to show something of yourself. You want to show some character. You want to, this scientific report, how films, when you watch a Christopher Nolan film, you're like, yeah, this makes sense, it's a Christopher Nolan film, it's that style, it has that Christopher Nolan style. or when you watch a Steven Spielberg movie, you're like, oh yeah, this has that style that is, evident in the rest of his films. I think scientific writing also has that kind of connection, this auteur connection, where, when you have your own style of writing a scientific paper, and you want to communicate that style to the readers. You want the reader to feel, what's going on in your head. They shouldn't be just given a recount on experimental findings. You want to also give them a take-home message. And this is the second point. And here is where you think about the only piece of information so you want that one needs to describe the topic at a considerable depth and explain the purpose of the paper. And so you want to, create this character, and you want to give them that take-home message. And so this should be, that piece of information that they can use to describe your entire paper and explain the paper's findings. And they should also be able to use the conclusion to talk about why your research is important. So you want to have the summation of all experimental findings, but then you also want to show some of that character, and you want to give them that take-home message, because ultimately it's up to you what insights and what applications you give them. And so you want to make sure that the insights and application you give them are, not only are important, but they also show your character as that scientific writer. Because if you notice, you have a film, and then you have extended cuts and, deleted scenes, because it's about what the, director wants to show you. Similarly, you want to show something to your readers. And that's something, and you have to keep that character alive throughout your entire presentation. Next, now let's look at the generic conclusions model. So there were only 2 key points. So when you're writing your conclusion, you want to start with what was in the paper. So you give them a recount. Then you talk about what the paper or study has achieved. So now you're looking at, the positive aspects. Then you want to provide relevant background information. So if someone's just skimming through this, they should be able to pick up those key relevant background pieces of information, and they should be able to use that to explain your paper. Then this is kind of, you're at the introduction stage right now. And then you want to give the gap, aim, or the need to study. So why was it necessary to study this? And now you've finished with the introduction. The first four parts were in the introduction. Fifth part, you want to give them the method or the approach. Don't spend too much time on this. Just give them a generic idea. If they should be able to, get a good idea of what happened, but it shouldn't be too specific. If they want to, get a specific idea, they can refer back to the section itself. So the method or approach, key results with evaluative comments. So here is where you talk about your key results, and you give them those evaluative comments. And evaluative language, evaluative comments are really important, because here is where you tell your reader, you kind of subconsciously, ingrain in the reader's mind that I want you to look at the results in this manner. And so if you say there was a striking drop between here and there, then they will look at the strikingness of the drop. And so if you want to get, a better idea of how to, show character in how you write, look at my video on writing the results for a scientific report. That has a good chunk of information on how to use evaluative language to direct your reader in the direction you want them to. So now you want to, spend one sentence on the key results and where you want to lead them to. The 7th part should be spent on the implications of the results. What subtle conclusions can we get from the results? Now, then you want to go a bit into the negative side. What were some limitations? Now, when you write about the limitations, make sure that you're not overemphasizing the limitations. Make sure that you're giving the limitations, but then you're also talking about why this could have positively happened, or you're minimizing the potency. Because when you talk about the limitations, you show character. But if you start overemphasizing them, people will think you're a clumsy scientist. So talk about your limitations, provide, this was a limitation, but I think this is why it happened. This is what can be done to mitigate it. And this also goes back to this. Now we're in the discussion stage, right? When you're talking about the limitations and implications. Then you want to go back to positive. Talk about your applications. And now you want to end on a positive note. You don't want to end on limitations. So now you want to talk about how your study advances knowledge. And then you want to give so basically you want to talk about what is the importance of your study at the end of the day. And as I say, you want to lead your researchers, lead your readers in a direction, right? And so now you want to give them potential future directions for research. So let's say you had a limitation. So you can put one of your limitations in here and use it to end on a positive tone. This is a limitation that I had. This is what we can do to, fix it. And people will be like, oh, I can fix this guy's limitation. I can run another experiment and I will not have to face this limitation. And what they will do is that they will run your experiment and then they'll, find this limitation and they'll use your limitation as, a direction for their research. So they can cite your paper, that this paper talked about this, but this was a limitation. So let me, redo the experiment without this limitation and see what happens to the results. And so you're giving this direction to, the serious readers that are really, concerned about your paper. So let's look at an example now. So this is about the rate law analysis of water oxidation on a hematite surface. This, as you can see, I've put the sources on here and refer to the sources if you want, a more detailed explanation. But essentially what I've done here is I've taken the conclusion, I've taken the purpose of the text, and I've tabulated it so you understand it better. And so let's take a look at this. The rate order of the water oxidation reaction has been investigated on hematite, photoanions, and photoinducers. So first of all, the writer outlines the key content of the paper. Yeah? Okay, I'll transition from the first order to the third order and photogenerate holes. The writer dwells into the discussion section, so where the key achievement of the papers has been identified. So you go straight into what was the key achievement of the paper. And so this one, and obviously, like I said, that you want to, recount your paper, but another thing is this also depends on how other papers are in the field are written. So rather than just strictly following this model, you want to look at how other people have written those papers, how other people that have done, rate law analysis have written the paper for this case, and this person did that, and this gives them an idea of the type of language they should use. The writer, and then in the third section, this transition was confirmed by agreement between three of them, rationalized by considering the rate limiting of formation. So the writer provides background information for context or for the upcoming parts of the conclusion. Now in the fourth and fifth part, what they do is that they provide an argument that is then used for the starting point for the need of their investigation. So now they're talking about why their investigation was actually needed. It is argued that this rate law is consistent with the reaction mechanisms based on recent observation of intermediates, blah, 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 blah. So now they're, introducing why you need to do the research. Then the writer uses evaluative language to identify the key results. So now that you've, demonstrated the need for your study and given, your reader an idea of what the results might show, you jump straight into the results. And here is where the reader has talked about the results using evaluative language. So let's take a look at this. I can say this study demonstrates the ability blah blah blah, but what they've done here is that they've used evaluative language. They've said this study clearly demonstrates the ability of a metal oxide semiconductor surface such as hematite to drive multi-hole reaction, but also highlights the modest catalytic properties of the surface. So now they're telling the reader that look, now they're making a subconsciously a dent in the reader's brain that look, I want you to look at this piece of information. Don't look at the graphs and stuff, but look at the graphs, but look at this specific part of the graphs. And so this is what they've done here. Now you want to look at some potential applications. That's what they've done here. Our findings will help tailor the design of metal oxide anodes for the need for photocatalysts to enhance function. So what does this paper do? How does this paper impact the field or the industry that you're in? Finally, the potential for further research in the field of future work is currently in progress with the different materials and ways to determine the function of each catalyst complex but fascinating reaction. So you end off with a positive note and you comment on the way on the direction of the field, of where the field is headed. And yeah, this is pretty much it. And yeah, Yeah, I don't think they've talked about limitations in this example. Yeah, there's nothing much on limitations, but I think, this is just, I see it, the limitation of the conclusion section, where they mentioned the limitation of the research, is actually in the last part. And so here they've talked about further work is currently in progress, where they talk about, this reaction with different types of papers, different types of materials, right? Sorry, not papers, materials. And so the key limitation of this paper was that it could only test for one material, hematite surfaces. But that limitation has been now being addressed by other papers that are testing it on other materials. And so and in this case, the limitation is presented at the end, because this limitation provides further direction for the research, and they're giving that direction. So although it may seem that although at first I thought there was no limitation of this paper, there actually is a limitation. And that limitation, as they've talked about the limitation very briefly, and then they've said how this limitation is being addressed by other papers in the field. So that's very smart. Now you're writing about a limitation and no one even knows that it's a limitation. So yeah, that's something that you want to do. Try and minimize your limitations. Like, talk about your limitations, minimize them, but focus on your solutions, or focus on how it's being addressed. So yeah, that's what you want to do. Okay? Yeah, that's it. Bye. That might have been, including limitations might have been decided based on if it was needed for this specific field, or this specific industry that this paper is concerned with. So yeah, I mean, so what I say is that this scaffold is very general. The first thing that you should do is look at other papers in your field that you're writing your research paper about. So find other papers from places like ResearchGate and see how they have written about the topic, and then you want to use their structure on the conclusions, and then if there's still doubts and stuff, you can refer back to this model. But yeah, that's it, and that's how you write the conclusion. Now the only thing that's left is the abstract, and the abstract should always be written last. So in the next video of the series, we're going to look at how to write the abstract. Till then, I hope you've learned something, and if you've enjoyed this video, that is very good. I'll see you in the next one. Keep grinding. Bye-bye. So, the abstract is something that you write last, but it ends up first on your scientific paper or your scientific report. And so, it's the thing that, gives that first impression to your reader. It's the first thing that the reader actually reads. And the way I think of an abstract is that it's a movie review with the spoilers. So your abstract is a paper review, but with what happened with the applications and what answer you got to your inquiry question. And so if the abstract is the thing that creates that first impression, it is very important that you write it well. And I know when you're at the end of that scientific paper and you've written the whole thing, the abstract can feel like, oh, I'm so relaxed, I'll do this very slowly, and like, it's okay, this can take up time, but it's a really important part of your report. So let's take a look. Let's go straight into it. Key points. First of all, write it at the end. Don't write it at the start. Why shouldn't I write the abstract at the start? Because when you write it at the end, you can get, you kind of have that, you start creating this mental framework of what your entire paper is about and what your key focuses are. And then you can, take those key focuses and put them in the abstract. However, when you write the abstract first, your entire paper is based on that abstract. There's two things that can happen. First of all, your entire paper is based on the abstract, or your paper starts to divert from the abstract. And when your entire paper is based on the abstract, it's bleak. There's nothing much to talk about, because then you're just gonna keep on referring back to the abstract for words, vocabulary, concepts and stuff. And let's say you're diverting from the abstract. That's the second case. What happens here is that the reader is like, well, this is not the paper is not consistent with the abstract. What's going on? So this leads us to our first key point. The abstract should enhance the visibility of the study. If it's not written well, the study may be overlooked. So ensure that you always write it at the end, because that's where you can, explicitly and very well summarize the rest of your paper. Now, second point, your contribution. Explicitly identify your own contribution. Since you are familiar with the study, it makes it harder for you to see the potential ambiguity in the abstract. And this is particularly important in identifying your own contributions. Because, if you don't, say what your contributions are, and you kind of, neglect them, the reader will think your contribution is something that has already been well established. And when they think that, they can't find the value of your research. They'll be like, okay, so this guy's talked about all this background information, but what is the value that this research paper provides? So in order to, say that I'm providing some value, explicitly identify your own contribution. So to do this, you should make sure that the reader understands the entirety of your report and your contribution. Okay, avoid reference ambiguity. Sometimes we think that we're going to sound so smart when we use synonyms of different words. So let's say I'm talking about, this and that, and then I start using different words for that. Like, let's say I'm talking about framework. And then I say, okay, so this was the framework we used for this. And then the next sentence, when I want to refer to the framework, I'm going to use the word model. So this framework was used to monitor the results. And then I say, the model had been very valid. Now you're going to think this framework and this model are two completely different things. So that is the one thing that you never want to do. Another thing is that you want to, stop using pronouns like this and that. So like, let's read this example. The experiment demonstrated an unexpected increase in tensile strength. This was significant because it contradicted previous findings. Okay, so what do you refer by when you say this? Tensile strength was significant because it contradicted previous findings? Or are you talking about the tensile strength? Are you talking about the increase in tensile strength? What are you talking about? And so that's reference ambiguity. You're saying this and that and this and that, and the reader's like, what are you talking about? What is this? What is that? And so a clearer example would be the experiment demonstrated an unexpected increase in tensile strength. This result was significant because it contradicted previous findings. Here, what you're doing is that you're referring to exactly what you want to talk about. This result. So now the reader knows that you're talking about the unexpected increase in tensile strength, not just the tensile strength itself. So third point, avoid reference ambiguity. Fourth point, consistent language. This is something that I talked about earlier. Make sure that when you're talking about words, you don't change them to their synonyms. So if something is referred to as an approach, do not use seemingly synonymous words such as framework, or when you're using the word model, it shouldn't be converted to the word method. A tool, when you're talking about a tool, don't use the word device. This decreases your clarity. And so you want to ensure that, if you're using the word approach, you only use the word approach. What this does is that it creates an echo chamber, and the reader knows exactly what you're talking about. And then they start, imagining this. They're able to visualize what you're saying. They're able to, map out what you're saying. Okay. Now, since the abstract is like really short and it summarizes your entire paper, the fifth point, you're going to tend to use longer sentences to make sure that you're fitting enough information. But here's the thing, sentences with fewer than 20 words, so small sentences, are understood by 90% of the audience. And sentences with more than 40 words, long sentences, are only understood by 10% of the audience. So, and an average of 22 words is what's understood in sentences. So what you want to do is that don't try and have longer sentences to make up for the lack of space. It doesn't help. Keep shorter sentences. At least that way you can ensure that the reader understands what you're talking about. Because if they don't understand what you're talking about and you have these long sentences, it doesn't make you sound smart. It kind of makes you sound, first of all, it shows that you're a boast. It shows that you're a boast because you're using longer sentences. And second of all, the reader can't even understand what you're saying. So what's the point of using all these long sentences? So those were key points. Next, it is a good idea to add basic background information. Now, I'm not saying spend your entire abstract on just talking about background information, but add some basic background information, depending on what you think the reader might know. And make sure this background information is really vital and is really connected to what your paper addresses. Now, citations. Citations shouldn't be needed unless your paper is derived from someone else's paper. Let's say in someone else's paper they talked about a limitation they had in their discussion section, and you're like, let me do this experiment again, let me do this research again, but this time I'll make sure that that limitation does not exist. In that case, your paper is based on someone else's, and you can include a citation to that paper that you got your inspiration from. But other than that, please don't include citations in your paper, because your reader just wants a key overview of what your paper is about. They're not going to look at other papers while they read your paper. Third point, method and results. Only use key points. Use numbers or words. Nevertheless, you need to emphasize the key methodology and results. So, many of us think that it's not, very smart to talk about the results or the method. But, the results and the method are things that give structure to your abstract. When people read your results, method and results, they get a clear idea of, what your paper is aimed at. And so it's really important that you emphasize them. So, this is where you have the chance to use, language. And this is where you have to, emphasize your methodology, because it provides that structure. So you have options. You can say something like, it is significantly greater. Or you can say it's 119% greater. It's up to you. So here, only state key points so that the reader is able, so in your method and results, only state key points so that your reader is able to decipher what happened. Don't try and necessarily explain how it was done. And so you can use key aspects of the method and key results you can explain with numbers. So look at the example. The graded structures were able to absorb around 140% more energy per unit volume than their non-graded counterparts before full densification. And then you have the densification numbers. See, that's why they've used numbers to emphasize the key methodology. But sometimes you don't need numbers. Sometimes you're like, words place a greater emphasis than the numbers. And look at the second example. The FWI velocity model reveals a sharp and more intense low velocity region associated with a gas cloud in which low velocity fingers match the location of velocity. So this makes sense to someone who's reading a paper. This probably makes sense to someone in that field who's reading that paper. And so decide if you want to use numbers or just explain things with words, but always place emphasis on your methodology, because that gives structure. Otherwise, the person can't really understand what your paper is about. And remember, your results and your methods are what leads the reader into believing what you want them to believe. Okay, keep the flow, but don't go slow. You have limited space for the abstract, and you need to fit everything while also making it sound good, not chunky. So here, instead of giving, one sentence, one function, what you do is you give one sentence, two functions, or one sentence, three functions. As you can see in these examples, one sentence is given the function of what the paper does and the achievement. So in this paper, we present a novel estimation method that combines the strengths of blah, 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 blah. Okay? The second example, they take the achievement of the paper and they take the gap that was addressed. It thereby provides a concept for low frequency hearing that accounts for a variety of unexplained experimental operations from the cochlear apex. So this is the achievement. It thereby provides a concept for low frequency hearing that accounts for a variety of, and now they introduce the gap that accounts for a variety of unexplained experimental observations. See, they've connected those two, and so you're not losing the flow, and you're also saving on space. Here, look, they talk about the method and the result. Specifically, addition of 13.3 milligrams per milliliters of 445S5 bioactive glass or SR50 or something resulted in significant inhibition. So the first, everything before the comma is the method, and everything after the comma resulted in significant inhibition is the result. And so as you can see, what this does is that it, saves on space and doesn't compromise on the flow. So now, how do you model a generic abstract model? Now, first of all, let me say that, when you model a generic abstract model, it should be, first of all, you should look at famous papers in the field that you're looking at, and then you should come to something this generic. You want to create a specific abstract model, and this is done by studying other papers in that field. And then what you want to do is that you want to create something, like create your own model and use that. And then if you're still having problems, you look at the generic abstract model here. Okay, so let's look at this. It's divided into 3 key sections. The first section, significance of the topic. So essential background information. So why is your whatever you're talking about important? And what do I need to know before I start, reading the paper? Second thing, the challenge or problem. Second thing in the first section, the challenge or problem. What challenge or problem are you addressing? And then you want to give them, like what does the paper or study do? So it may include your achievement or value, and use happy words such as, use happy words. And so what this does, if you use words like the results were extremely accurate, the results were extremely reliable, it makes the reader think that, oh, this guy's research is actually valid, and they'll start, feeling that sense of reliability and credibility in what you're saying. Okay, number 2. In number 2, section 1, method or materials and happy words. So here you describe your method and the materials you used, and also use those happy words, saying that this extremely accurate method, blah blah blah, something like that. Don't make it too obvious there. And then say results, talk about the results, use happy words, and then also create comparisons with existing results. So how does your how do your results relate to existing results? And then you also want to talk about your implications. So what insights are there in the data? Why did the things happen as they happened? So how did the method and how did the results, how are the results linked to the method? So what in the method made the results happen? Something like that. Now, third section. Now here's where you start off, link it back to the field itself. You want to go back to the field, the entirety of the field. So you want to map your research to the existing knowledge. So there's this much research on this field. Let's say this big bubble of information in this field. Where exactly does your paper sit? Does it sit here? Does it sit here? Does it sit here? So this is where you map. Like this is my paper sits with amongst this category of this subcategory of papers. Then you want to talk about your achievement or value or contribution that you've had. And also here, use happy words so the reader thinks that your contribution is actually accurate and makes sense. Then finally, you talk about applications. How does this impact the world? How does your field and how does what you found out actually impact the world? Also use happy words. Use happy words all the time because it makes the reader think that what you're saying really matters. And it kind of elevates the entire writing experience, and it also elevates the reader experience as well. But don't overemphasize, like don't say my research is groundbreaking, blah blah blah. If you look at one of the previous videos in this series, we talk about how confidence is important. Use modal language that reflects confidence, because if you start saying, oh, my paper does this, my paper does that, my paper is this accurate, and if it's really not, other researchers will cross-check your research and say this guy is lying. So don't take it to extreme levels where you're just making random claims. You want to use these happy words to the extent that you're confident with. If you think that your paper is at this level of achievement, then only use happy words that are with that level, and don't use anything less or don't use anything more, because that really gives that idea that this person really knows what they're talking about, and it shows character. Okay, so now let's look at a example of an abstract. This is on the rate law analysis of water oxidation on a hematite surface. This, if you want to see the conclusion for this, check the last video where we talk about the conclusion. And here, the first category, and then the first sentence. Water oxidation is a key chemical reaction central to both biology. So the writer introduces the significance of the topic. Okay, now that they've stated the importance, they're gonna bring to light a challenge. Despite recent progress. Here, look, that's a key word. Despite recent progress. So someone that's skimming it will know, like, okay, now this person is going to introduce their problem. Despite recent progress from the structure of the natural so remains a significant challenge. Okay. Now, in the second section, the writer states what the paper or study does with reference to the methods and materials. We report herein a rate law analysis. So this is what the paper does. They're reporting a rate law analysis. What I say is employing photo-induced absorption spectroscopy. Yes. So now what they're doing is that they talk about what the paper is, and then they talk about how they've employed photo-induced absorption spectroscopy. And so now they're, relating it to the methods. So this, you see what they've done here? They've combined sentence functions, and this is something that we talked about on how it saves space. Okay. Third thing, the writer reviews the results and implications of the study with evaluative language, and happy words. Evaluative language and happy words. The implication is a note. This is important. The implication is a conclusion that cannot be immediately figured and often requires an analysis. Here the word sufficient hints the implication. Our study reveals a transition from a slow first order reaction at low accumulated Hall density to a faster third order mechanism. Once the surface Hall density is sufficient to enable the oxidation of nearest neighbor metal atoms. So as you can see here, the writer reveals the results, and they've used the word sufficient to enable the oxidation of nearest neighbor metal atoms. This hints the implication. So now they've talked about the results, and then now they're going into that discussion section where they're like talking about the implications. Sufficient to enable the oxidation of nearest neighbor atoms. Last section. The writer emphasizes the value of the research and states its application with happy words. This study thus provides direct evidence, that's a happy word, that makes the reader think that this person's research is credible, for the multi-hole catalysis of water oxidation by hematite, and demonstrates the Hall accumulation level required to achieve this, leading to key insights. So now you've got two key words, two happy words, both for reaction mechanism and strategies to enhance function. 3 key words. That definitely has a great impact on the reader. And so, yeah, this is how you write the abstract. And so, yeah, this ends this report writing series. So thank you for joining me on this entire series as I explained how to write all components of the reports. I hope you enjoyed this video and all the other videos in the series, and I hope that you've learned something. I'll try and make new videos and more topics, and yeah, I'll try and keep working hard. And I'll see you guys in my next video. Till then, keep grinding. Bye bye.